Sure, thank you. In my short time, um, take you back as young as I can remember. My father was trying to be a small farmer, one of the last tribal farmers, and he worked up there, the Lavador home place up on the bench above Thorn Hollow. And I can always remember hot summer evenings and seeing these large bucks in velvet walking down the hillside and then jumping this tall fence into the pasture with the horses. And they just strolled down to the water trough to get water. And it's like they've been doing that forever. But then they'd go back up into the hillside above the fields and in all the buckbrush, hawthorn brush. And as I proceeded to get bigger and older, I was able to go a little further. I was too small to get on the tractor, but I would go all over in that brush. I could only go so far, but I could go into that brush and get glimpses of those deer. And I can remember seeing whitetail flags, the tails. So the whitetail were there too. But like I said, I got older, I got to go a little further over the ridge, and I would be able to see the Telephone Ridge area, and they could see elk out there in early in the mornings because my dad always started early in the morning. So I got to get out there fairly early and see elk just scattered. And this is in the summertime, foraging all over in the Buckaroo drainage. And it seemed like the seasons were just according to calendar. Summers were summers, winters were winters. And the animals herded up in the wintertime, stayed on the foothills, seemed like all winter. And late spring, they would start dispersing back slowly, and all the cows were all bunched together. The bulls were off up higher. And I remember large snowdrifts. The winters were always lots of storms and big snowdrifts left on the foothills till late spring. And they'd be dotted with large herds of mule deer as they dispersed later in the spring. But as I got older, we started seeing more human impacts to that. The Honda Trail 90 came out in the early 60s, and it just seemed like you saw them everywhere, up every ridge, and people just traversing, and those herds just slowly disappeared. You didn't see them anymore. I can remember watching one guy ride up this ridge right above or below a herd of mule deer. He didn't even know they were there. And that herd just stood there and watched him. And as soon as they must have got in sight or something, but they all just exploded and they were gone. And it just seemed like over time, we started seeing more human impacts like that in the hunting areas. The non-Indians even hunted at that time on the reservation. And you saw rigs on every ridge in the morning before daylight. You see headlights just lining the ridges. And it just seemed like over time then you started seeing more and more of these activities occurring year round. And I think and today it's even more so now with the innovation of the four-wheeler and the four-wheel drives. And I think the different activities, especially this last year, was kind of a rare one where so many people didn't have anything to do, and so they went to the mountains. And the mountains were impacted like, I don't know, I've never seen it like that in my lifetime, where there's people literally up there 7 days a week in the mountains, and that had to affect the wildlife. So I kind of think, I don't think it just does climate change. I think it's climate human change. And I think there's very little discussion of that in these presentations, and I think we ought to incorporate that because it is part of that. And I would hope that we can have those discussions and maybe try to find a way to address that, even with the tribal folks. I think we got to look at ourselves and how we're doing something and how we're being perceived, and how and if it impacts our treaty rights. Is it strengthening it? Is it weakening it? And are we going to be under the auspices of regulations of other entities besides ourselves? I just hope that we lay everything out on the table and look at the impacts that are occurring. Livestock is another big impact. In my younger years, I can remember a lot of there weren't that many livestock producers then, but they had herds that they cowboyed. They literally had people up there moving them around on horses. And then over time, more people became livestock people, but they also had jobs. So they either ran up there and pushed them around when they could, or they hired somebody that would maybe not do it as they probably should have. But I think today we're not seriously thinking about those impacts and what changes we could have to maybe protect the first foods. And also in the roads. In the early days, I can remember you could go to the Forest Service and pick up a map, and the map wasn't covered with roads, it was covered with trails. The Forest Service put a lot of effort into building trails throughout the forest system in the early days. And now you look at it and it's, what is it, 90,000 miles of roads in the forest now. And those roads, as they evolve, the standards, they have to have certain slopes, certain widths, and that's impeding the wildlife to migrate, to have sanctuary. And the reservation's impacted by that. We were heavily impacted by early roads, the railroad, logging for railroad ties, firewood. There's remnant roads up almost every canyon here on the reservation because that's what they were doing, extracting those trees for railroad ties or firewood. And then since then, those roads were in early 70s. The tribe was, through the Bureau was implementing logging activities on the reservation by a few tribal members had logging businesses. And they were able to go up and open up some of those canyons. Telephone Ridge was one that they punched open with those roads. Used to be just one road going in. Now there's a couple, and they weren't to any standards, but we're still utilizing those, and it's impacting the resources. So I hope we just step back and take a look at what we've done today, and then compared to what we were doing in the early days, and how can we find that happy medium, and maybe thinking about slowing down when we go to the mountains, and maybe do a little more walking, and not so much picture taking or selfies. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. We're honored to have your knowledge. And I agree with you about the slowing down. It's absolutely necessary. Thank you so much for sharing your observations. I know that we have Jeremy is here. I have your photos that I've organized chronologically that I'd love to share if you're willing to share some of your observations. Or Corrine, if you want to jump in there. Oh, Jeremy.
Sure. And Cord, you can hop in whenever you want. I just got back on. My speakers for some reason weren't working, but yeah, you want to put those up, then I can speak on those for sure.
Perfect.
So this was actually from the very first year that we reclaimed our rights to go back over and hunt in bison country. This is the Gardner Basin over in Montana, the northern entrance to Yellowstone. The mountain in the back there, I believe it's called Electric Mountain. It's inside the park there. we're on the opposite side, and the north side of Gardner, looking for some bison there. We didn't find any in that area and thought it was a good spot to take a picture. And unbeknownst, I was also trying to figure, obviously pretty amazed and being in the area. It was the first time I was in that area. And the cold, the amount of snow, blanketing the area, it was an average year for them, from what the locals said. But at the same time, it's usually what pushes the animals out from the park is the weather, is the snow, the cold, and the availability of forage. So at this point, they hadn't. You can kind of see the blue skies, and the temperatures kind of were starting to warm up in those days, and there wasn't a lot of movement of the bison at that time. So we're kind of frantically driving all over the place, walking as far as we can, and just couldn't find them anywhere until a few days later. But you can go on next slide. So this is when we finally got the first bison, and this was not to get too much into the hunt itself, but these animals are pretty amazing creatures. I mean, they are, they'll bust through snow pretty easily, but even so, it's pretty interesting to see how they move within the snow itself, and they'll walk in each other's paths and stay in straight lines. And but just kind of wanted to make sure and memorialize these as we go over there, because this was 2011. Climate change has been on our mind for some time, and just noting the amount of snow and blanketing of the area there hasn't been the same. There's definitely been times in the recent past where we've had to change our entire hunting time frame when we go over, and not being able to just essentially go in winter, and when our season's open. Our season currently is open from December 1st through the end of March, and the month of March is getting into when they're pregnant and calving. So calves or cows are off the permit. So, but that being said, a lot of our hunters have been going later in the season because it takes so long for the weather to come, really. This was, I believe, in January when we first went over. But yeah, since then, primarily our hunters have gone and set their permits for, if not late January, primarily in February and into March now. Next slide. So a big part of the work that we've been doing over there is a lot of outreach. This was a large group of people over in the Gardner Basin area, and been a tough interaction with the locals there. I think that because of the weather, because of the increased interest in the hunting parties per tribe, but also the amount of tribes, there's been some increase in different tribes who have started exercising hunting over there. We've had to be very cognizant of our regulations and our in working and communicating with other tribes, setting up a MOA for first of its kind in that area for the Gardner area. The Gardner area, for those of you who don't know, is a sliver of a piece of land. It's this national forest lands right adjacent to the park. There's an annexed area, a northern area that was added to the park on the other side of Yellowstone River from Gardner. after it was established as a national park. And but that is where the trap is, and so moving beyond that is usually the corridor where the bison, a lot of the bison, not all of them, but a good amount of the bison come out that way, follow that corridor, that annexed area along the river to that sliver of a piece of land. And so without having me to really explain to that you can understand that might be a kind of a hot point for hunters to kind of gather from time to time, especially when there isn't a lot of animals out on the landscape. So that had become a kind of a hotly contested area, as far as shooting lines, as they described them. In many cases they were coordinated efforts between hunting parties, shooting in different directions or safety zones. And then the MOA that I described earlier was between 4 tribes, ours, Yakima, Nez Perce, and Salish Kootenai. Trying to get some of the other tribes to sign on to it, because it helps coordinate our enforcement and our hunters. And then, to begin with, in setting the regulations, our committees and commissions and policy, of course, help set that up. And but that helps us out, and it's worked really well. Unfortunately, there just hasn't been a lot of case study as far as the amount of hunters during that time. This last year, again, the issue becomes when the animals are coming out, and because it's becoming a narrower and narrower window, there's more and more hunters, not only in a certain area, but during a certain time. So that has been a kind of a direct correlation. I wouldn't say it's scientific. I'm not taking data or anything down. This is my observations, and a lot of people's observations over there is that the weather seems to be coming a lot later and for a shorter amount of time, and at higher temperatures. It's not getting as cold as it used to. So with that being said, that causes a lot of pressures, not only with the hunt itself, and potential safety measures, potential inefficiencies of the different hunts. We want to get over there, get in there, get our animals, and get home. It's a long trip, expensive trip, so you want to get in there and get home and in a safe manner. But it's also, it causes some stress for certain individuals in the area. We try to remind the quote unquote locals that this is our home as well. As we consider ourselves locals, and we try and treat the area and the people there and the animals specifically with respect as best we can. So we do a lot of outreach with them. This is just one of those events that we took them out and heard their grievances and tried to explain to them what we're trying to do to remedy the issues, and as well as just be inclusive, and hear their ideas out. Go next slide. And this is an area. We're driving through the annexed area, so we couldn't shoot these animals. These were near the town of Gardner and at a rock quarry there. Yeah, there's just a kind of a close up. It's pretty amazing, being right next to Yellowstone. You get to be right next to these animals. There's elk all over the place, antelope, and obviously there's kind of a checkerboarded area of land, public and private, in addition to the actual park itself. Next slide. And here's some animals in the annex area in the trap itself. So these animals were trapped. And so this is another part of our coordination and collaborations with the Park Service, and understanding the coordination needed, and prioritizing the trust responsibility of the tribes and their hunts, making the hunt as a priority. That we've developed a trap protocols that have been adopted for the last couple of years now in the the winter ops developed within the interagency bison management plan. And so we've been very vocal and pressuring these communications and these protocols to help guide how this trap is operated in relationship to allowing the hunt to happen as volitionally as possible for those animals to move past that trap and to not only be harvested but to be out onto the landscape, the greater landscape in the greater Yellowstone area. It's had its ups and downs, and we've made some more updates this year to help help ensure that the Park Service truly understands what we're saying when we talk about coordination. They're trying to come back with us saying that they were going to communicate with us in the morning at Monday meeting or morning meetings that we would have, but then they were trying to put language into there to say that, but we're going to have potential operations throughout the day that we won't be able to report. And it just, that just kind of defeated the purpose of the protocols. So we had to have a lot of back and forth on that, but we finally agreed on some appropriate language. So we're hopefully communicating appropriately. So next slide. And then this was the last time I went, and you can see the landscape, how different it is. And so 2019, it was the first year I came back without anything. And this is just inside the park. There's a old archway that enters into the park, and that's the city of Gardner right there. And the archway's off to the left, but they didn't move. I mean, they kind of, this is about as far as they went. They just kind of parked it and had no real influence. And like I said, it's forage and it's the temperatures and things that and weather itself that moves these animals out of the park. But in this case, there wasn't a lot of reason for them to go anywhere. Next slide. Yeah, and I think that was it. So if hopefully we're getting to a point this year. Seems like there's a little bit better weather patterns. I believe we're in a La Nina this year, so I guess that's somewhat hopeful, I guess. So as far as potential weather systems, it could be influential. But yeah, it feels as though we're on a razor blade as far as the consistency and the understanding of what to expect. I think it was a lot easier just within the last 10 or 15 years to understand the different weather patterns that were going to be available. And in fact, we moved our hunting season from January 1st to December 1st because we had quite a few weather events in December, not only here, but up in Montana. But that just hasn't been the case in even the last 2 or 3 years. So we're hopeful, but we also understand that we have to be cognizant of these different weather patterns and with weather changes because that are occurring rather drastically over the last few years. But that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. And it's always great to see photos, especially over time and a certain time point. I wanted to also, Corrine, if you wanted to share, we would welcome your perspectives.
Oh, thank you, Colleen. I'll share a few words with you today, and I appreciate Colleen and all the presenters today. I think we just received an enormous amount of information. We certainly know climate change will shift both the timing and location of our first foods, and our responsibility to protect, preserve, conserve, and enhance our treaty rights will heavily rely on the climate adaptation plan and the first foods policy moving forward. And I'm confident in our Cultural Resources Department and programs to continue to lead our efforts in maintaining and enhancing our resources but ultimately it's all of our responsibility. The Fish and Wildlife Commission is our regulatory authority to ensure policy codes and treaty rights are balanced and in alignment of our management of our fish and wildlife resources. We have a yearly cycle or a seasonal round that has us traveling from hunt camps to fishing places, digging and gathering sites. When we talk about buffalo, going to buffalo is a historic phrase that echoes in our history. And this phrase was used when our ancestors would travel to buffalo country to harvest. And the Yellowstone buffalo hunt is a big part of the Fish and Wildlife Commission's livelihood, from negotiations in the regulations to herd management input down to, like Jeremy said, enforcement alongside the hunters. Fish and Wildlife Commission works extremely hard to keep this big game men's food on our table here at the CTUIR, and oftentimes have had to fight and claw our way to have a seat at that table. But we are continuing to work hard to do that, and I look forward to more information and education, because I think we can all agree that information and education is how we'll ensure that climate adaptation becomes a part of our daily lives, and more importantly, integrated into policies that protect our treaty rights and first foods. And so today, I'd like to leave you with some words of Young Chief that were spoken at the 1855 Treaty Council. I wonder if the ground has anything to say. I wonder if the ground is listening to what is said. I wonder if the ground would come alive and what is on it. Though I hear what the ground says it is the Great Spirit that placed me here. The Great Spirit tells me, take care of the Indians, to feed them all right. The Great Spirit appointed the roots to feed the Indians on. The water says the same thing. The Great Spirit directs me, feed the Indians well. The ground, the water, and grass say, the Great Spirit has given us our names. We have these names and hold these names. The ground says the Great Spirit has placed me here to produce all that grows on me, trees and fruit. The same way the ground says, it was from me man was made. The Great Spirit, in placing man of the earth, desired them to take good care of the ground and to do each other no harm. Young Chief, 1855 Treaty Council. Thank you. That's all I have, Corrine.
Thank you. Those are powerful words. Thank you so much for sharing and for being here and for the work you do. And